What if the life you were meant to live was stolen from you before you were ever born? What if the truth of your identity was buried under decades of lies, greed, and silence, waiting for a single, chance encounter to bring it all to light? For one waitress, struggling to keep her head above water in a world that seemed determined to drown her, a few words spoken in a forgotten language would change everything. This is a story about a tarnished silver locket, a note left on a diner table, and a test of character so profound it could either shatter a life or rebuild a legacy from the ashes of a heartbreaking betrayal. The smell of stale coffee and fried onions was the scent of Alara's life. It clung to her uniform, her hair, her very soul. Each morning, she pinned on her name tag, smoothed the wrinkles from her black apron, and prepared for another 10-hour shift of balancing plates, refilling ketchup bottles, and smiling until her cheeks ached. The Greasy Spoon Diner wasn't a career, it was a trench, a place of survival where she fought a daily war against exhaustion and despair. The spoils of that war were meager tips, crumpled dollar bills that she counted with a knot in her stomach, each one a tiny, insufficient soldier in the much larger battle for her brother's life. Leo was her world. Her sunshine. Her reason for breathing. And he was sick. A rare genetic disorder was slowly, cruelly stealing the strength from his small body, and the treatments were a mountain of debt she could never hope to climb. Every smile she gave a customer, every time she said, "Enjoy your meal," her mind was on him, on the ticking clock of his health and the ever-growing pile of medical bills on her small kitchen table. She lived in a state of quiet, sympathetic desperation, a condition invisible to the people she served, who saw only a polite waitress with tired eyes. On a Tuesday that felt like any other, the bell above the diner door chimed, admitting a wave of damp, chilly air and two tourists who looked utterly lost. They were an older couple, clutching a map and speaking to each other in rapid, anxious French. They sat in her section, their faces a mask of confusion as they stared at the English menu. Alara approached, her pen and pad ready. "Can I help you?" she asked, her standard greeting. The man looked up, relieved to be acknowledged but unable to bridge the linguistic gap. "Pardon, madame, nous ne parlons pas anglais. Le menu." He gestured helplessly. A flicker of something long dormant sparked within Alara. It was the language of her mother, the soft, melodic cadence of lullabies and bedtime stories from a childhood that felt a lifetime away. Her mother, Annette, had passed away years ago, taking with her the only real warmth Alara had ever known, leaving behind only a worn silver locket and a language that had no place in the Greasy Spoon Diner. Without thinking, she switched. "Bien sûr, monsieur. J'ai pour vous aider," she replied, her French flowing with a natural, unpracticed grace. "What would you like to know?" "The daily special is meatloaf, but I would not recommend it." The couple's faces lit up with astonished delight. They chatted with her, asking for recommendations, telling her a little about their trip. She took their order, translating hash browns and sunny side up with a smile that, for the first time all day, felt genuine. It was a brief, pleasant exchange, a tiny island of human connection in her ocean of worry. She didn't notice the man in the corner booth. He had been there for an hour, nursing a single black coffee, his presence as still and imposing as the granite skyscraper that bore his name downtown. He wore a suit that cost more than her annual salary, but his face was etched with a profound, almost tragic loneliness. His name was Arthur Sterling, a reclusive billionaire whose empire was the stuff of legends and whose private life was a fortress of solitude. He hadn't been watching her, he had been listening. And as he listened to the specific, regional accent of her French, an accent he hadn't heard in 30 years, the world around him had dissolved. He was no longer in a cheap diner, he was on a mountainside in the Alps, under a blanket of stars, with a woman whose laughter he thought he had forgotten. When Alara brought the French couple their check, they thanked her profusely, leaving a generous tip that made her heart leap with gratitude. It was enough to cover Leo's prescription this week. As she cleared their table, she saw the man in the corner booth stand up, place a few bills on his own table, and walk out without a word. She went to clear his table, expecting to find the standard $2 tip for a coffee. Instead, she found a crisp $100 bill. Tucked beneath it was a heavy card, thick as cream. On it, in elegant, decisive handwriting, was an address, the address of the Sterling Tower, a time for the following day, and 2 words, "Ask for me." Beneath the card was a second slip of paper. It was a printed confirmation for a first-class, open-ended ticket to Geneva, Switzerland. Elara stared at the items on the sticky table, the smell of onions and stale coffee suddenly fading away, replaced by the dizzying scent of impossibility. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and a wild, terrifying hope. The quiet desperation of her life had just been shattered by a silent, deafening boom. Elara's hands trembled as she held the card. Sterling Tower. The name was synonymous with power, a monolith of glass and steel that scraped the sky and looked down on the rest of the city with cold indifference. It was a world away from her cramped apartment and the weary grid of the diner. The plane ticket felt alien in her hand, a passport to a life she couldn't even imagine. For a moment, she was certain it was a mistake, a cruel prank left for the wrong waitress. Who was this man, and why would he leave this for her? Her shift ended in a blur. She walked home through the darkening streets, the card and ticket tucked safely in her apron pocket, feeling their weight with every step. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of questions and doubts. Was this dangerous? Was the man some kind of predator, luring her in with an offer too good to be true? The world had taught Elara to be wary of kindness without a price tag. And this price tag, a trip to Geneva, felt impossibly high. But then, an image of Leo flashed in her mind. His face, pale but always trying to smile for her. The beeping machines by his bed. The doctor's gentle but firm words about a new experimental treatment, a treatment so expensive it might as well be on the moon. The $100 bill in her other pocket was a tangible reality. It was medicine. It was a week without panic. What if the rest of it was real, too? What if this was the answer to a prayer she had been too tired to even whisper anymore? Back in her small apartment, the pile of red-stamped medical bills on the table seemed to mock her. She sat down and called her brother. "Hey, sleepyhead," she said, forcing a cheerful tone into her voice. "Hi, Ellie." Leo's voice was weak, but it was the sweetest sound in the world to her. "Did you have a good day?" "It was interesting," she said, looking at the ticket on the table. How could she even begin to explain? "How are you feeling?" They talked for 20 minutes, about his nurses, about a cartoon he watched, about the Jell-O he had for dinner. She didn't mention the man, the note, or the ticket. It was too fragile a hope to share, too easily broken. After she hung up, the silence of her apartment felt heavier than ever. The next morning, she made her decision. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She put on the nicest blouse she owned, a simple navy blue one she'd bought at a thrift store, and took the bus downtown. Standing at the foot of Sterling Tower, she felt a wave of vertigo. The building was more than just tall, it was arrogant, a monument to a level of wealth and influence that made her feel like an ant. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of marble and silence. A security guard with an earpiece eyed her simple clothes with suspicion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat. I have an appointment," she stammered, her voice feeling small in the cavernous space. "With Mr. Sterling." The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to disbelief. He spoke into his wrist. A moment later, a woman in a perfectly tailored suit appeared, her heels clicking with quiet authority on the polished floor. "Miss Elara." Elara Vance. She had no idea if he even knew her name, but she gave it anyway. The woman, his executive assistant, led her to a private elevator. The ride was silent, ascending 50 floors in a smooth, stomach-lurching rush. The doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse office. 3 of the walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking, godlike view of the city below. The space was vast, minimalist, and decorated in shades of gray and black. It was as cold and imposing as the man who now stood looking out the window, his back to her. Arthur Sterling turned. In the daylight, he looked older, his face a roadmap of stress and sorrow. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, were intelligent and deeply weary. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was gravelly, low. "Thank you for coming." "You left this for me," Elara said, holding up the card. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I don't understand." He gestured to one of the two stark leather chairs facing his massive desk. "Please. Sit." She sat on the edge of the chair, feeling swallowed by it. He remained standing, studying her with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable. "You speak French," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes. My mother taught me." "Your accent," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's specific. From the Savoy region. A small village in the Alps. Am I correct?" Elara was stunned. "Yes. My mother grew up there. In a village called Bryson." A flicker of something, pain, recognition, something she couldn't name, crossed his face before being instantly suppressed. He walked to his desk and sat down, a vast expanse of polished obsidian separating them. "I am looking for someone," he said, his tone shifting to pure business. "A woman I knew a long time ago. Her name was Annette Dubois. I lost contact with her 30 years ago. I have spent a great deal of money and resources trying to find her, with no success." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "The accent you have." It was her accent. The way you said, "bien sûr," it was exactly the way she said it. Elara's heart began to pound. Annette. Her mother's name. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. "I want to hire you, Miss Vance," Sterling said. "I want you to work for me as a consultant. I will provide you with all of my research, all of my files. I want you to go through them. Your connection to that region, to that dialect, you may see something my private investigators have missed. A turn of phrase, a local reference. Something. Hire me." Elara was bewildered. "To do what?" "Look at old papers." "I'm a waitress, Mr. Sterling. I have no qualifications for." "Your qualification," he interrupted, his voice sharp, "is the sound of your voice. It is the language your mother gave you." He named a salary. It was an absurd number, a figure so large it didn't seem real. It was enough to pay for Leo's experimental treatment 10 times over. It was enough to change everything, forever. "Why?" she whispered, searching his face for an answer. "Why me? Why so much?" "Because I am a man who has everything except the one thing he wants," an answer, Sterling said, his voice softening for the first time. "I am willing to pay for even the slimmest chance of finding it." He was watching her, testing her. This wasn't just a job offer, it was a move in a game she didn't understand. He wasn't just offering her money, he was offering her a riddle and waiting to see if she was clever enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to try and solve it. Elara thought of Leo. She thought of the mountain of bills. This was a lifeline. It might be a strange, complicated, and even dangerous one, but it was the only one she had. "I'll do it," she said, her voice clear and firm. "But I need to be able to see my brother. And I need the first month's salary in advance. For his medical bills." Sterling gave a curt nod, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It's already been arranged. An account has been opened in your name. The funds were transferred an hour ago." He had been so sure she would say yes. The thought was chilling. She had walked into his world, and he had already anticipated her every move. She had accepted his offer, but she had the unsettling feeling that she had just stepped into a gilded cage. The next morning, Elara's life as a waitress was over. She was escorted not to the penthouse, but to a large, sterile office 2 floors below. It was her office. Her name was on a small, tasteful plaque on the door, Elara Vance, consultant. The room was dominated by a large mahogany table, upon which sat a dozen heavy archival boxes. Her gilded cage had a desk. Sterling's assistant, a severe but efficient woman named Ms. Albright, gave her a brief tour. "Mr. Sterling has instructed that you are to have anything you need. A car service is at your disposal. All meals will be provided. Your only focus is the project." The message was clear: you are a well-cared-for tool. Now, get to work. Left alone, Elara approached the boxes with a sense of trepidation. She lifted the lid of the first one. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were stacks of old photographs, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, and leather-bound journals. It was an archive of a life, Arthur Sterling's life, from a time before he became a recluse in a tower of glass. She spent the first few days simply absorbing it all. The photographs showed a young Arthur, vibrant and smiling, his arm around a beautiful woman with kind, intelligent eyes and a cascade of dark hair. This had to be Annette. Her mother. The thought was so outlandish, so impossible, that Elara had to keep pushing it away. It was a coincidence of names, nothing more. But as she looked at the woman's face, she felt an undeniable, gut-wrenching pang of familiarity. The shape of her smile, the way she held her head, it was the woman from the faded photos on her own mantelpiece. The letters were from the late 1980s, written in French. They were passionate, filled with the breathless energy of new love. They chronicled a whirlwind romance in the small alpine village of Bryson, where a young, ambitious Arthur Sterling had been overseeing the construction of his first European hotel. Annette was a local guide, a botanist who knew the mountain trails like the back of her hand. They wrote of shared dreams, of a future together, of building a life far from the cutthroat world of his family's business. Elara felt like a voyeur, reading these intimate exchanges. But Sterling had told her to look for clues, for anything that resonated. And something did. In one letter, Annette described singing a lullaby to a neighbor's crying child. She wrote out the first line: "Petite étoile, dors maintenant, le monte garde gentiment, little star, sleep now, the mountain guards you kindly." Elara dropped the letter. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same lullaby her mother had sung to her every single night of her childhood. The melody, the words, were etched into her memory. This could not be a coincidence. It was a direct, impossible link between the ghost in these boxes and the mother she had loved and lost. Her hands shaking, she gathered the letter and took the private elevator up to the penthouse. She found Sterling standing before the great window, staring down at the city as if it were a chessboard. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice unsteady. He turned, his expression unreadable. "You found something." "This letter," she said, holding it out. "Annette writes about a lullaby," she recited the line in French. "My mother, she used to sing that exact song to me." For a long moment, Sterling said nothing. He simply stared at her, and in his gray eyes, she saw a storm of emotions swirling beneath the calm surface. There was shock, pain, and a glimmer of something that looked terrifyingly like hope. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low whisper, almost inaudible. "Tell me about your mother, Elara." And so she did. She spoke of Annette Vance, a kind, quiet woman who worked as a seamstress, who always seemed to carry a deep sadness with her. She told him how her mother had raised her alone, never speaking of her father, saying only that he was a man from a different world whom she had loved very much. She told him how her mother had died of a sudden illness 5 years ago, leaving Elara with nothing but a small apartment, a mountain of questions, and a worn silver locket. As she spoke, she watched Arthur Sterling's face. The mask of the powerful billionaire was gone. In his place was a man hollowed out by grief, a man who was hearing the epilogue to a story he thought had ended 30 years ago. The investigation had begun as a search for a stranger named Annette Dubois. But Elara was starting to understand that she wasn't just looking for a ghost. She was uncovering her own. And the truth, she suspected, was going to be far more complicated and painful than a simple lullaby. The gilded cage was shrinking, and she was no longer sure if she was the researcher or the subject of the experiment. The revelation of the lullaby shifted the atmosphere in the Sterling Tower. The project was no longer a detached, intellectual exercise, it had become deeply, frighteningly personal. Arthur Sterling, though still remote, began to spend more time with Alara. He would appear in her office silently, picking up a photograph of Annette and staring at it for long minutes before leaving without a word. Their conversations were stilted, focused on the facts within the boxes, but beneath the surface, an unspoken question pulsed between them: who are you, really? Alara worked with a feverish intensity, driven by a need to understand the gaping hole at the center of her own life. She pieced together a timeline. Arthur and Annette's romance had blossomed over a single summer. The letters stopped abruptly in the autumn of 1989. The last one from Arthur was full of excitement about returning to the States to confront his father and formally leave the family business so he could be with Annette permanently. The last one from Annette was a joyful, loving reply, eagerly awaiting his return. And then, nothing. A silent, 30-year abyss. It was in the fourth week of her employment that the next piece of the puzzle appeared, not from the boxes, but in the form of a man. He strode into her office without knocking, exuding an aura of polished charm and effortless privilege. He was handsome, in his late 30s, with a salesman's perfect smile and eyes as cold and calculating as a shark's. "You must be the mysterious new consultant," he said, his voice smooth as silk. He extended a hand. "Julian Vance. Arthur is my uncle." Alara froze. Vance. It was her name. Her mother's name after she came to America. Her own last name. The coincidence was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. It's nice to meet you," she managed, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, possessive. "I'm the head of the Sterling Foundation," he explained, leaning casually against her desk. "I handle the family's more delicate affairs. So naturally, I was curious about my uncle's latest project. He's been rather secretive." His eyes scanned her desk, lingering on a photo of Annette. "He's chasing ghosts, I hear." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. He looked at Alara, his smile tightening. "And he's hired you, a waitress, to help him. Forgive my bluntness, but what exactly are your qualifications?" "Mr. Sterling felt my background might offer a unique perspective," Alara said, her voice cool despite the tremor in her hands. "Ah, yes. The French connection," Julian mused. "Quaint." He circled her desk, an apex predator surveying its territory. "My uncle is a brilliant man, but his grief has always been a liability. He's vulnerable. It would be a terrible shame if someone were to take advantage of that vulnerability for personal gain." The threat was no longer veiled, it was hanging in the air between them, sharp and clear. Julian Vance saw her not as a consultant, but as an interloper, a threat to his position as the heir apparent to the Sterling Empire. From that day on, Julian became a constant, unnerving presence. He would pop into her office with flimsy excuses, asking about her progress, offering help that was clearly designed to obstruct. He arranged for her to meet with a historian he claimed was an expert on the Savoy region. The man turned out to be a fraud who wasted 2 days of her time. He borrowed a crucial journal from her desk, claiming his uncle needed it, and it was returned a week later with a key page, one detailing Arthur's plans to propose to Annette, mysteriously torn out. The most blatant act of sabotage came one afternoon when Alara was working on a large, detailed map of Bryson and the surrounding mountains. She had spent a week painstakingly marking the locations mentioned in the letters, trying to reconstruct Arthur and Annette's movements. Julian entered with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use a break," he said, his smile wider than usual. As he set a cup down on her desk, he tripped, sending the hot coffee cascading across the delicate paper. "Oh, my heavens! I am so clumsy," he exclaimed, dabbing at the spreading brown stain with a napkin, making it worse. "I am terribly sorry. This looks like it was important." Alara stared at the ruined map, the ink bleeding into an indecipherable mess. She looked up at Julian's face, at the faint apology in his eyes, and she saw the truth. This was a warning. She felt a surge of cold fury. She was not just some pawn he could sweep off the board. This was her mother's story. Her story. That evening, she went to Sterling's penthouse. "I can't work like this," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Your nephew is sabotaging me. He's trying to stop me from finding anything." Arthur Sterling listened, his face as impassive as stone. He looked from her to the city lights beyond the window. She expected him to be angry, to promise to handle Julian. Instead, he was silent for a long time. "Julian is my brother's son," he said finally, his voice low and heavy. "He believes he is protecting his family's interests. And mine." He turned to face her, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "If what he is doing is stopping you, then you are not the person I need for this job." Elara was speechless. It was another test. A test of her will, her resilience. He wasn't going to fight her battles for her. "You think I'll just give up?" she asked, incredulous. "I think," Sterling said, his voice devoid of emotion, "that the truth does not reveal itself to those who are easily deterred." She left his office that night feeling more isolated than ever, but her fear was now forged into a steely resolve. Julian Vance had made a critical error. He thought he was dealing with a desperate waitress. He had no idea he was facing a daughter fighting for her mother's legacy. The war in the Sterling Tower had just begun, and Elara had no intention of surrendering. The gauntlet had been thrown. Elara refused to be broken by Julian's petty warfare. She began to work with a new cunning, a strategic mindset she didn't know she possessed. She started making digital copies of every document she handled, saving them to a secure cloud server Julian couldn't access. She stopped discussing her progress openly and began communicating with Sterling through discreet, coded memos delivered by Ms. Albright, bypassing Julian's watchful eyes. She painstakingly recreated the ruined map from her saved digital photos, working late into the night, fueled by coffee and a burning need for answers. The opulence of the Sterling Tower no longer intimidated her, she saw it now as a battlefield, and she was learning its terrain. Her investigation had stalled on the central mystery, why the communication between Arthur and Annette had ceased so abruptly. The official story, according to the few existing records from that time, was that Arthur had been called back to New York for a family emergency involving his father's health. But the letters showed he had intended to return to Bryson within a week. He never did. What had happened in that week? Elara shifted her focus from the romance in the Alps to the family dynamics in New York. Sterling's father had been a domineering patriarch, and his older brother, Edward, Julian's father, was his ambitious right-hand man. The journals from that period were filled with Arthur's frustration, his feeling of being trapped in a life he didn't want. He wrote of constant conflict with Edward, who viewed his younger brother's artistic and romantic inclinations as a weakness, a threat to the Sterling legacy. The clue she needed came from an unexpected place. Ms. Albright, who had been with the company for 40 years and was fiercely loyal to Arthur, mentioned in passing that Sterling's late mother had been a meticulous archivist of family history. Most of her belongings were in a climate-controlled storage unit. Sensing a potential avenue around Julian's obstruction, Elara asked Sterling for access. He agreed, providing her with a key and a location. The storage unit was a sterile, chilly room filled with perfectly labeled boxes. It was a museum of a wealthy family's life. Elara spent a full day sifting through photo albums, society clippings, and business correspondence. It seemed like another dead end. Then, in a large steamer trunk containing old silverware and linens, she felt a false bottom. Her heart hammered. She pried it open with a letter opener. Inside was a small, oilskin pouch. And inside the pouch, tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a packet of letters. They were written in French, on thin, delicate airmail paper. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. It was Annette's. But these letters were different from the ones in the office. They were dated after the communication was supposed to have stopped. And they were not addressed to Arthur in France, but to his private address in New York. They had been sent, but clearly, they had never reached him. Elara sat on the cold floor of the storage unit and began to read. The first letter was filled with confusion and worry. "My love," Annette wrote, "it has been 2 weeks, and I have heard nothing. I pray you are well. Your silence frightens me. Did something happen with your father? Please, just a word to let me know you are safe." The letters grew more desperate. She had tried calling his New York office, but the secretaries were cold, telling her Mr. Sterling was unavailable. Then, the tone shifted. A man had arrived in Bryson. A man from Arthur's family. "A man came to see me today, my love. He said his name was Edward. Your brother. He was kind, but his eyes were sad. He told me there was a terrible accident. That you were hurt and that your family was asking for privacy. He gave me money, a great deal of it, and told me it was from you. He said you wanted me to be safe, to start a new life somewhere else. He said you would contact me when you were able, but that for now, I had to disappear. He said it was to protect me." Elara felt sick. Edward. Julian's father. He had intercepted the letters. He had gone to Annette and lied to her. She read on, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the thin paper. The final letter was written from a small town outside Paris, several months later. It was stained with tears. "My dearest Arthur, I must accept now that I will never hear from you again. Edward's stories no longer make sense. I know in my heart you would have found a way to reach me. I can only assume the life you have is one I can no longer be a part of. But I want you to know, wherever you are, that I will never stop loving you. And I will not be alone. I am with child. Our child. I will raise them with all the love you gave me this summer. I will tell them about the kind, brilliant man who taught me how to see the stars. And I will name our daughter Elara, after the brightest star in the constellation Lyra, the one we watched from the mountaintop. That way, a part of you, the best part, will always be shining in my life." Elara dropped the letter. A strangled sob escaped her lips. Elara. Her own name. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a legacy. She fumbled at her neck, her fingers finding the familiar cool metal of the silver locket her mother had given her. The locket Arthur had given Annette. Everything clicked into place, a horrifying, heartbreaking mosaic of lies. Her mother hadn't abandoned him. He hadn't abandoned her. They had been torn apart by a jealous brother. And she was the secret they had never been allowed to share. She was not Elara Vance, the waitress. She was Elara Sterling, the daughter of Arthur Sterling and Annette Dubois, a living, breathing ghost he had hired to solve the mystery of her own existence. The weight of this revelation was crushing, a 30-year-old avalanche of grief and betrayal crashing down upon her in the cold silence of the storage unit. The drive back to Sterling Tower was a blur. Elara sat in the back of the town car, the oilskin pouch of letters clutched in her hand like a sacred relic. Her mind was a maelstrom. Arthur Sterling was her father. The reclusive billionaire, the man of immense power and profound sadness, was her father. The thought was so monumental it was difficult to process. For her entire life, her father had been a nameless, faceless question mark. Now, he had a name, a face, a skyscraper. But what did it mean? What was she supposed to do? March into his penthouse and declare herself his long-lost daughter? He had hired her as a consultant. He saw her as a tool, a key. Would he even believe her? Or would he see this as the ultimate deception, a desperate waitress trying to fabricate a connection to his fortune? Julian's warnings echoed in her ears. He had already painted her as a potential grifter. This discovery would be all the proof he needed. She spent the night in her office, the letters spread out on her desk, reading them over and over again until the words were burned into her memory. She was paralyzed by indecision. The truth was a bomb, and she had no idea if it would liberate them or destroy everything. The next morning, before she could formulate a plan, Julian appeared in her doorway. He didn't bother with his usual pretense of charm. His face was a tight mask of aggression. "My uncle's private storage. I saw the access logs," he said, his voice a low snarl. "What were you looking for?" Elara met his gaze, her fear replaced by a cold, steady calm. "The truth." Julian laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Let me tell you about the truth, Miss Vance. The truth is that my uncle is an old man clinging to a fantasy. And the truth is that you are an opportunist who has wormed her way into his confidence. But this little treasure hunt of yours is over." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know what you think you're finding. Bits and pieces. A love story. It's touching. But it's also a threat to the stability of this company. To this family." He paused, his eyes flicking to the oilskin pouch on her desk. A flicker of recognition, and panic, crossed his face. He knew. He must have known about the letters, or at least suspected their existence. His demeanor shifted instantly. The aggression vanished, replaced by a conspiratorial smoothness. "Look, Elara. I might have misjudged you." He pulled up a chair, his posture suddenly open, friendly. "My father. Edward, he wasn't a bad man. He was pragmatic. He saw a summer fling that was distracting his brilliant brother from his destiny. He did what he thought was necessary to protect the sterling name from a scandal. A marriage to a penniless French girl? It would have been a disaster in those days." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a persuasive murmur. "He protected Arthur. And now, I'm trying to do the same thing. And I want to protect you, too." This was it. The move she hadn't anticipated. "What do you want, Julian?" she asked, her voice flat. "I want this to end quietly," he said. "For everyone's sake. You found what you were looking for. A story. Now it's time for it to be over." He slid a thick envelope across the desk. "Inside this is a contract. It establishes a blind trust in your name. $10 million. Tax-free. Another $5 million for your brother's care, guaranteed for the rest of his life. The best doctors, the best facilities. Everything he could ever need." Elara stared at the envelope. It was the answer to every problem she had ever had. It was security. It was Leo's future, guaranteed. "What's the price?" she asked, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. "The price is silence," Julian said softly. "You take the letters. You take the money. And you disappear. You sign an NDA, of course. You never contact Arthur again. You let him believe that Annette is lost forever. Let the trail go cold. In a way," he added, a sickeningly pious look on his face, "it's a mercy. It gives him closure. He can finally stop searching." The temptation was immense, a physical force pressing down on her. $10 million. Leo, safe forever. All she had to do was walk away. All she had to do was honor a lie, bury her mother's truth, and leave her father to drown in his lonely grief, never knowing he had a daughter who had been standing right in front of him for weeks. She thought of her mother, alone and pregnant, writing those desperate letters. She thought of Leo, and the kind of sister she wanted to be for him, not one who sold her soul, but one who fought for what was right. She looked at Julian, at his smug, confident face, so certain he could buy her, that her integrity had a price tag. Slowly, she pushed the envelope back across the desk toward him. "My mother's story is not for sale," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the force of her conviction. "And my father's peace of mind isn't yours to bargain with." Julian's mask of civility dissolved. His face contorted with rage. "You foolish, sentimental girl," he hissed, rising to his feet. You have no idea what you've just done. You could have had everything. Instead, you'll have nothing. I will go to my uncle right now and prove to him that you are nothing but a common fraud who tried to blackmail this family. You just signed your own eviction notice." He stormed out of the office, leaving Elara alone with the letters, the rejected fortune, and the terrifying certainty that the final confrontation was now unavoidable. She had made her choice. She had chosen truth over security. Now, she would have to face the consequences. The summons came less than an hour later. Miss Albright appeared at her door, her face pale and strained. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you. In the penthouse. Now." Elara gathered the oilskin pouch, her hands steady. The fear and indecision were gone, replaced by a strange, clarifying calm. She had made her moral choice, and whatever came next, she would face it with her head held high. She walked to the elevator, feeling the weight of 30 years of history in the small bundle of letters she carried. When the elevator doors opened, the scene in the penthouse was one of high tension. Arthur Sterling stood behind his massive desk, his posture rigid, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. Julian was standing near the window, a smirk of triumph on his face. He had gotten to his uncle first. "Miss Vance," Sterling's voice was arctic. It was the voice of the ruthless CEO, the man who built an empire and crushed his rivals. "Mr. Vance has just presented me with some disturbing information." He gestured to his desk, where a file lay open. Inside were documents, bank statements, transaction records. "He alleges that you have been attempting to defraud me. That you have fabricated a connection to my past in order to extort money from this family. He has provided evidence that shows large sums of money being funneled into an offshore account set up in your name." Elara looked at the documents. They were convincing forgeries, no doubt Julian's handiwork. She then looked at Julian, who gave her a small, mocking shrug, as if to say, "I told you so." She could deny it. She could try to fight his fabricated evidence with her own denials. But she knew that would be a losing battle. He had laid a perfect trap. So she didn't. She walked forward and placed the oilskin pouch on the desk, next to Julian's file of lies. "That evidence is meaningless," she said, her voice clear and strong, filling the silent room. "This is the only evidence that matters." She looked directly at Arthur Sterling, not as an employee to her boss, but as a woman to a man. "You hired me to find Annette Dubois. But all this time, I was the one who was lost. And you were the one who found me." She reached up and unclasped the thin silver chain around her neck. She laid the worn locket on top of the letters. "My mother, Annette, gave this to me before she died. She told me it was a gift from my father, a man she loved more than anything. A man she was forced to leave." Sterling stared at the locket. His breath hitched. He reached out a trembling hand and picked it up, his thumb tracing the faded, familiar engraving on its surface, a tiny star, from the constellation Lyra. His carefully constructed wall of emotional control began to crumble, brick by brick. "Read the letters," Elara urged gently. "They were sent to you. But you never received them." With Julian watching in growing horror, Arthur opened the pouch and took out the thin, brittle pages. He began to read. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint rustle of paper. Elara watched his face as he absorbed the words, as 30 years of a cold, hard lie melted away in the heat of a searing truth. She saw the confusion, the dawning comprehension, the wave of agony, and finally, the profound, earth-shattering revelation. He read the final letter, the one that spoke of a child, of a name. His eyes lifted from the page and found hers. They were filled with tears, with 3 decades of stolen grief. "Elara," he whispered, the name a question, a prayer, a statement of impossible fact. He looked from her face to the face of Annette in a photograph on his desk, and back again. He saw it. The same eyes. The same smile. The same strength. The perspective shifted, just for a moment, to Arthur's mind. He was no longer in his penthouse. He was a young man again, placing that locket around Annette's neck, promising her a lifetime. He remembered his brother Edward's return from Europe, the grim look on his face. He remembered the lies Edward had told him, that Annette had taken the money he offered and left with another man, that she never truly loved him. He had believed it. The pain had been so immense that he had buried it, building an empire on top of its grave. And all this time, the truth had been alive. She had been alive. "It's you," he said, his voice breaking. "All this time, it was you." He looked past Alara to his nephew, and the grief in his eyes hardened into a diamond-hard rage. "It was him. Your father. He did this." The full truth was finally in the room, a living, breathing entity. Edward, motivated by jealousy and a twisted sense of duty, had orchestrated the entire tragedy. And Julian, his son, had spent his life perpetuating the lie, protecting his inheritance at the cost of his uncle's soul. The cascade was complete. The dam of secrets had broken. The confrontation turned on Julian, swift and brutal. Arthur Sterling, the grieving father, receded, and Arthur Sterling, the formidable titan of industry, took his place. His voice, once choked with emotion, was now laced with ice. "You knew," he said, his words falling like chips of stone. He took a step toward his nephew, who instinctively shrank back. "Your father poisoned my life with his lies, and you let that poison fester. You knew I was searching. You watched me spend millions, waste years of my life chasing a ghost, when you knew the truth all along." Julian, stripped of his smirk, scrambled for a defense. I was protecting you. Protecting the family. Father did what he thought was right. She was a nobody, a distraction. She would have ruined you. She was my life," Arthur roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "And you and your father took her from me. You didn't protect this family, you mutilated it for profit." It was Alara who delivered the final, quiet blow. She stepped forward, her anger cold and precise. "You talk about protecting him," she said, her gaze fixed on Julian. "But you weren't protecting him from a gold digger. You were protecting your inheritance from a daughter. You saw his grief not as a wound to be healed, but as a wall to hide behind. My mother lived her entire life believing the man she loved had abandoned her. My father has lived his life believing he was betrayed. You didn't save a legacy, Julian. You built yours on the ruins of their happiness." The fight went out of Julian's eyes, replaced by the dull look of defeat. He knew it was over. Arthur pressed a button on his desk phone. "Ms. Albright, please get Mr. Davies from legal and 2 members of security up to the penthouse immediately." The arrival of the lawyer and guards was swift and silent. Arthur laid out the situation with cold, clipped precision. He spoke of the letters, of Julian's attempt to bribe Alara into silence, of the fraudulent documents planted to discredit her. "Julian," Arthur said, his voice devoid of any last shred of familial warmth, "you are fired from all positions within this company and its foundations, effective immediately. You are disinherited. I am removing you from my will and any and all family trusts. The security team will escort you from the building. You will return any company property. Your personal effects will be sent to you." Julian's face was ashen. "Uncle, please. Do not call me that," Arthur commanded. "Mr. Davies will be in touch with your lawyers regarding the fraudulent bank records you created. I suspect the district attorney will be very interested in your activities at the foundation as well. Now, get out of my sight." Julian didn't say another word. His perfect world had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. He was a king who had become a peasant. As the security guards led him to the elevator, a fallen prince being exiled from his kingdom, he looked back at Alara one last time. There was no anger in his eyes now, only a hollow emptiness. He had gambled everything on her being greedy and weak, and he had lost to a strength he could never comprehend, integrity. The climax was not a shout, but a quiet, decisive click of an elevator door closing, sealing a lifetime of deceit in the past. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, the world shifted on its axis. The Sterling Empire was rocked by the news of Julian Vance's sudden and dramatic departure, with vague press releases citing internal restructuring. The truth, however, remained a private matter, a fragile new reality being carefully nurtured within the walls of the penthouse. The first and most important change was for Leo. Within days, he was transferred via a private medical jet to the world's leading pediatric care facility in Boston. The country's best doctors now surrounded him, and the experimental treatment that had once been an impossible dream was now his reality. His prognosis, once grim, became hopeful, then optimistic, then excellent. Elara was by his side through it all. She held his hand during treatments, read to him for hours, and watched with a heart full of overwhelming gratitude as the color returned to his cheeks and the light returned to his eyes. Arthur was there, too. He flew to Boston, his presence at first awkward and tentative. He was a man who knew how to command a boardroom, not how to comfort a sick child or connect with a daughter he had never known. He would stand in the doorway of Leo's room, unsure of his place. But Elara would smile and beckon him in. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build a bridge across the 30-year chasm that had separated them. He learned about Leo's favorite superheroes. He listened as Elara told him stories about Annette, small, intimate details that brought the woman in his old photographs to vibrant life. One afternoon, in a quiet hospital waiting room, surrounded by lawyers, Arthur Sterling officially and legally acknowledged Elara as his daughter. The papers were signed, the documents filed. Elara Vance, the waitress, ceased to exist. In her place was Elara Sterling. The name felt strange on her tongue, but as she looked at her father's face, softened by a tentative smile, and thought of her brother sleeping peacefully down the hall, she knew she was finally, truly home. The storm had passed, justice had been served, and the fragmented pieces of a broken family were beginning to knit themselves back together. Months later, the crisp autumn air swept across the balcony of the penthouse. The city below was a glittering tapestry of a million lights, a world that no longer seemed intimidating, but beautiful. Elara leaned on the railing, a soft cashmere shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a gift from her father. Inside, the sound of laughter could be heard. Leo, vibrant and healthy, was teaching a thoroughly bewildered Arthur how to play a video game. The sight was so beautifully normal, so wonderfully mundane, that it brought tears to Elara's eyes. Arthur stepped out onto the balcony, a warm mug of tea in his hands, and passed it to her. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city breathe. She would have loved this, Arthur said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She would have loved seeing you here. Seeing him so well. She's here, Elara replied, touching the locket that still hung around her neck. She never left us. He nodded, a sad smile on his face. I spent 30 years building an empire out of anger and loss. I thought power was the answer. I filled my life with things, but my life was empty. You and Leo, you filled it. He looked at her, his eyes shining with a father's pride. You have your mother's strength, Elara. When Julian offered you that money, you could have taken it. No one would have blamed you. But you chose the truth instead. It was never a choice, she said simply. Some things aren't for sale. A life built on lies is a foundation of sand, destined to be washed away by the tide of truth. For 30 years, a great injustice had stood, casting a long shadow over 3 lives. But it could not stand forever. It took a single moment of connection in a noisy diner, a few words in a forgotten dialect, and the unwavering integrity of a young woman who had nothing, yet possessed the one thing that truly mattered. In the end, Elara's greatest inheritance was not the sterling fortune, but the discovery of who she was and the profound peace that comes from making a broken thing whole again. How many secrets live in the quiet moments of our own lives, waiting for a single act of courage to bring them into the light? If this story of hope and redemption touched your heart, please share it with others who believe in the power of truth. Like and subscribe for more stories that inspire.